Sometimes the deepest loneliness comes not from being alone, but from believing you'll never be understood again. For 70-year-old Roy Callahan, grief had carved out a life of silence on his Montana ranch, where winters were long and memories even longer. He'd spent years in that solitude, speaking only to his donkey Mercy, convinced his story had already been written. Then, one frozen evening, Mercy led him to a woman collapsed at his gate. Grace was running from something, carrying wounds she wouldn't name. What unfolded between two broken souls in the middle of nowhere would prove that second chances don't come with warning labels. Could a man who'd given up on connection find it again with a stranger who'd given up on trust? Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story moves you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow we have something truly special waiting. The ranch had belonged to the Callahan family for 3 generations, though Roy suspected he'd be the last to work this land. The house sat in a valley between 2 low ridges, protected from the worst of the northern winds, but never quite sheltered enough. 200 acres of prairie grass and rocky soil, a barn that leaned slightly to the east, and a creek that ran clear in spring but turned to ice by November. It wasn't much by modern standards, but it had been enough for him and Sarah. Sarah. Even her name brought a tightness to his chest that 5 years hadn't eased. Roy stood at the kitchen window, his calloused hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee that had gone lukewarm. Dawn was just breaking over the eastern ridge, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. The thermometer outside read 12 degrees. He'd need to break the ice in the water troughs before the cattle got too thirsty. The kitchen was exactly as Sarah had left it. Same yellow curtains she'd sewn herself, same ceramic rooster on the windowsill, same wooden table, where they'd shared 37 years of meals and conversations. Roy had considered changing things after she passed, thought maybe it would help him move forward. But every time he tried, he found himself unable to touch anything that still carried her presence. The wedding ring on his left hand caught the morning light. He twisted it absently, a habit he'd developed over the decades. The gold had worn thin in places, the inside of the band smooth from constant contact with his skin. Sarah had slipped it on his finger in a small church in Billings, back when his hands were smoother and his hair was dark instead of steel grey. "You're dwelling again," he said aloud to the empty room. His voice sounded rough from disuse. Some days, Mercy was the only soul he spoke to. As if summoned by the thought, a bray echoed from the barn. Roy smiled despite himself. Mercy had her own schedule, and she expected him to keep to it. The donkey had been a gift from Sarah, purchased at an auction. 15 years ago, when Sarah decided the ranch needed something with personality. Roy had protested that they already had cattle, 2 horses, and a barn cat with an attitude problem. But Sarah had that look in her eyes, the one that meant her mind was made up. "She'll be good company," Sarah had said, running her hand along the donkey's grey coat. "And she's already named. The previous owner called her Mercy because she showed up at their place during a drought, like a blessing." Roy had rolled his eyes at the sentimentality, but he'd built Mercy a proper stall and made sure she had the best hay. That was how it worked with Sarah. She'd see something that needed caring for, and Roy would figure out the practical details of making it happen. Now, Mercy was all he had left of those days. He pulled on his work coat, a heavy canvas thing lined with fleece that had seen better years. His boots were by the door, crusted with yesterday's mud and manure. The morning routine was always the same: feed Mercy, check the cattle, break ice, repair whatever had broken overnight. The repetition was comforting in its way. It gave shape to days that otherwise threatened to blur together into nothing. The cold hit him like a physical force when he stepped outside. His breath formed white clouds in the air, and the snow crunched under his boots with that particular sound it made when the temperature dropped well below freezing. The sky was clear, which meant it would be a bright day but a cold one. No new snow, at least. The last storm had dumped 8 inches, and Roy had spent 2 days digging out. The barn door resisted, ice having formed in the hinges overnight. He put his shoulder into it and felt the familiar protest in his lower back. 70 years old, and his body reminded him of it every morning. But he was still strong enough to work the ranch, still capable of doing what needed doing. That counted for something. Inside the barn, Mercy greeted him with another bray, and an impatient stamp of her hooves. She was 20 now, getting old herself, but she still had plenty of opinions about how things should be run. I know, Roy said, grabbing a flake of hay from the stack. 5 minutes late. You'll survive. Mercy watched him with dark, intelligent eyes as he filled her feeder. She was a small donkey, barely 11 hands high, with a grey coat that had lightened to almost white around her muzzle. Sarah used to say Mercy had an old soul, that she understood more than most people gave her credit for. Roy had thought it was nonsense at the time. Now he wasn't so sure. He ran his hand along Mercy's neck, feeling the coarse hair under his palm. Just you and me, girl. Like always. The words hung in the cold air, like always. It had been his reality for 5 years now, ever since the cancer took Sarah. The doctors had given her 6 months, and she'd made it 8 through sheer stubbornness. Roy had nursed her at home, learned to manage pain. Medications and wound care, sat by her bedside, reading aloud from the books she loved. In the end, she'd slipped away on a Tuesday morning while he was downstairs making coffee. He'd found her still and peaceful, her hand resting on the quilt her grandmother had made. The grief had hit him like a collapsing building, crushing and complete. For weeks afterward, he'd barely functioned. Friends from town had checked on him, brought casseroles and condolences. His daughter Jennifer had flown in from Seattle, stayed for 2 weeks, and begged him to sell the ranch and move closer to her family. But Roy couldn't leave. This was where he and Sarah had built their life. Every fence post, every tree they'd planted, every room in the house held memories he wasn't ready to abandon. So Jennifer had returned to her life on the coast, calling every Sunday without fail, and Roy had settled into a new normal defined by silence and routine. The cattle were waiting by the fence line when he made his way. To the pasture, 18 head of Angus, sturdy and patient in the cold. They knew the schedule as well as Mercy did. Roy broke the ice on their water trough with a metal bar, the sound ringing out across the empty landscape. He checked each animal, looking for signs of illness or injury, though they all seemed fine. This land had a way of demanding constant attention. Fences needed mending, equipment needed maintenance, weather needed watching. In summer, there was hay to cut and stack. In winter, there was snow to clear and animals to protect from the cold. The work never ended, and that was exactly how Roy wanted it. Idle time meant thinking time, and thinking led him down paths he'd rather not travel. He was back in the barn, fixing a broken hinge on one of the stall doors, when Mercy started acting strange. She paced in her stall, ears swiveling, making small, anxious sounds. Roy had rarely heard from her. He set down his tools and approached her slowly. "What's got into you?" Mercy pushed her nose against his chest, then moved toward the barn door, looking back at him expectantly. This wasn't normal behavior. She was trying to tell him something. "All right," Roy said, following her out into the cold. Mercy didn't head toward her usual spots. Instead, she made straight for the ranch gate, nearly a quarter mile from the house. Roy followed, his curiosity growing into concern. Mercy was purposeful, urgent even, in a way that set off alarm bells in his mind. The gate marked the boundary between his property and the country road beyond. It was a simple thing, 2 metal poles with a chain that Roy kept locked. Nobody came out this way, except by mistake. The nearest neighbor was 6 miles down the road, and they had their own access. As they approached, Roy saw something that made his heart skip. A shape in the snow, just beyond the gate. Dark fabric against white ground, too large to be an animal. He broke into a run, his boots slipping on the icy ground. Mercy trotted alongside him, her breath coming in white puffs. It was a person, a woman, curled on her side in the snow, her face pale and lips tinged blue. She wore a thin jacket, completely inadequate for the weather, and her hands were bare. No gloves, no hat. How long had she been here? Roy knelt beside her, his knees protesting against the frozen ground. He pressed 2 fingers against her neck, searching for a pulse. There, faint but present, she was alive. "Ma'am." His voice was urgent now, stripped of the quiet reserve he'd cultivated. "Can you hear me?" No response. Her skin was cold to the touch, and she wasn't shivering, which he knew was a bad sign. The body stopped shivering when hypothermia reached dangerous stages. Roy looked back toward the house, calculating. He couldn't carry her that far, not at his age, not in this cold. He needed to get her warm and fast. The barn was closer, but the house had heat and proper shelter. He made his decision quickly, gathering the woman in. His arms, he was struck by how light she felt, almost fragile. She appeared to be in her 60s, her hair dark with threads of grey, her face lined with age and what looked like recent hardship. There were bruises on her jaw, fading to yellow-green, and her hands were scraped raw. Mercy led the way back to the house, moving faster than Roy had seen her move in years. He focused on putting one foot in front of the other, his arms burning with effort, his breath coming hard. The cold bit at his exposed skin, but he barely noticed. All that mattered was getting this woman inside. The house felt like a furnace when he finally pushed through the door. He carried her straight to the living room, laying her carefully on the couch that he'd barely used since Sarah died. Her breathing was shallow, her face still that terrible pale color. Roy moved quickly, decades of ranch work having taught him to act decisively in emergencies. He started a fire in the wood stove, then grabbed every blanket he could find. Sarah's quilts, the wool throw from their bedroom, even the old sleeping bag from the hall closet. He piled them over the woman, then went to the kitchen to fill a hot water bottle. As he waited for the water to heat, he really looked at her for the first time. Even unconscious and half-frozen, there was something in her face that spoke of strength. The set of her jaw, the lines around her eyes, the way her hands were curled protectively against her chest. This was someone who'd faced hard things before. But what was she doing out here? How had she ended up collapsed in the snow at his gate, miles from anywhere, dressed like she'd just stepped out for a casual walk? Roy placed the hot water bottle near her feet, careful not to warm her too quickly. He'd seen hypothermia before, knew that rewarming had to be gradual. Then he did something he hadn't done in 5 years. He picked up the phone and called for help. The ambulance would take at least 40 minutes to reach the ranch, maybe longer in these conditions. The dispatcher asked him questions he couldn't answer. Who was she? What had happened? How long had she been outside? "I don't know," Roy admitted, "but she needs help now." After he hung up, he pulled a chair close to the couch and sat down to wait. The woman's breathing seemed to be getting stronger, and some color was returning to her cheeks. That was good. That was progress. Mercy had followed them inside, standing in the doorway to the living room like a sentinel. Roy had never let her in the house before Sarah had drawn the line at barn animals on her clean floors, but today seemed like a day for breaking rules. "You found her," Roy said quietly to the donkey. "Don't know how you knew she was there, but you did." Mercy's ears twitched, and she took a few steps closer, sniffing the air. Roy turned his attention back to the woman. In the firelight, he could see more details. Her clothes were worn but clean. She had a small pack with her, which he'd grabbed from the snow, containing a water bottle, a few protein bars, and a paperback book so worn the cover was falling off. No wallet, no identification, no phone. She was running from something. Or to something. Either way, she'd ended up at his gate on the coldest night of the year. As the minutes ticked by and the warmth from the stove filled the room, Roy found himself studying her face. There was something familiar about it. Not in features, but in expression. It was the look of someone who'd lost something essential and was trying to figure out how to keep going anyway. He recognized it because he saw it in his own mirror every morning. The woman's eyelids fluttered. Roy leaned forward, his heart rate picking up. Her lips moved, forming words too quiet to hear. Then her eyes opened, unfocused and confused, searching the unfamiliar ceiling above her. "It's all right," Roy said gently. "You're safe. You're inside, you're warming up. Help is on the way." Her gaze found his face, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other. Two strangers brought together by chance and a donkey's intuition on a frozen Montana morning. "Where?" Her voice was barely a whisper, rough and uncertain. "My ranch, about 30 miles outside of Choteau. My donkey found you at the gate. You were pretty far gone." She closed her eyes, and Roy saw a tear slip down her temple. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." "Nothing to be sorry for," Roy said, though he had no idea what she was apologizing for. "Just rest. The ambulance will be here soon." But even as he said it, Roy felt something shift in the quiet space of his living room. Mercy settled down on the floor by the couch, content to keep watch. The fire crackled in the stove, and somewhere in the back of his mind, Roy heard Sarah's voice, clear as day. "Something that needs caring for." He looked at the woman, fragile and mysterious, and very much in need, and felt the first crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. The ambulance arrived 43 minutes later, its lights cutting through the grey morning without the siren. Two paramedics Roy had never seen before came through his door with equipment and efficient movements. They checked the woman's vitals, asked Roy the same questions the dispatcher had, and prepared to move her onto a stretcher. That's when everything changed. "No." The woman's voice was stronger now, sharp with sudden panic. She pushed herself upright on the couch, the blankets falling away. "I'm not going." The female paramedic, a young woman with kind eyes, moved closer. "Ma'am, you've suffered significant cold exposure. We need to get you to the hospital for proper evaluation and treatment." I said no. The woman was trembling, but not from the cold anymore. Her hands gripped the edge of the blanket like a lifeline, and her eyes had gone wide with something that looked like fear. "I'm fine. I don't need a hospital." "You were unconscious in the snow," the other paramedic said, his tone reasonable but firm. "You could have frostbite, hypothermia complications. I know what I could have." She cut him off, her voice taking on an edge. "And I'm telling you I'm not going." Roy stood back, watching the scene unfold with growing concern. This wasn't simple stubbornness, this was terror, barely controlled. The woman's whole body was tense, ready to bolt despite the fact that she could barely sit upright. The paramedics exchanged glances. "Ma'am, we can't force you to accept treatment if you're conscious and competent, but we strongly advise." "I'm not going." She said it with such finality that both paramedics fell silent. The female paramedic tried a different approach. "Is there someone we can call? Family? Friends who can stay with you?" "No." The word came out flat, final. Another exchange of glances. The male paramedic sighed and pulled out a form. "Then we'll need you to sign a refusal of treatment. You understand that you're declining medical care against our recommendation." "I understand." Her hand shook as she signed the paper, but her signature was clear enough. The paramedics gave Roy a look that said, "This happens more often than you'd think," packed up their equipment, and headed for the door. Before leaving, the female paramedic turned back. "Keep her warm. Watch for confusion, slurred speech, or loss of consciousness. If any of those happen, call 911 immediately. And honestly, she should see a doctor within the next 24 hours, regardless." Roy nodded, and then they were gone, leaving him alone with a stranger who just refused medical care and had nowhere else to go. The silence stretched between them. The woman wouldn't meet his eyes, her gaze fixed on her hands in her lap. Roy could see her fingers were red and raw, the skin damaged from exposure. She needed those hands looked at, needed a proper examination, needed a lot of things she was clearly unwilling to accept. "You got a name?" Roy asked finally, keeping his voice gentle. A long pause. "Grace." "Grace." He let the name settle. "I'm Roy Callahan. This is my ranch." She nodded slightly, still not looking at him. "Thank you for bringing me inside. I'll leave as soon as I can." "Leave? To where?" "Anywhere but here." Roy pulled the chair closer and sat down, moving slowly so as not to startle her. "Grace, it's 12 degrees outside. You've got no proper winter gear, no vehicle that I can see, and you can barely stand up. Where exactly do you think you're going? That's not your problem. Well, it kind of became my problem when my donkey found you dying at my gate. He kept his tone mild, conversational. Now, I'm not going to force you to do anything, but I'd appreciate knowing what I'm dealing with here. Grace finally looked at him. Her eyes were hazel, he noticed, and there was the intelligence in them mixed with exhaustion and wariness. She was evaluating him, trying to decide how much truth she could afford to tell. I'm just passing through, she said carefully. I was walking to the next town and I guess I misjudged the distance, or the cold, or both. Walking from where? Does it matter? Might. She was quiet for a moment, her jaw working like she was chewing on words she didn't want to say. I got off a bus in Chateau yesterday, started walking north. Thought there'd be somewhere to stop before dark, but there wasn't. Chateau's 30 miles south of here, and there's nothing north of my ranch for another 50 miles except national forest and empty land. Roy's voice remained calm, but his concern was growing. That's not passing through. That's running. Grace's face tightened. I don't know you. You don't know me. I appreciate the help, but I don't owe you my life story. Fair enough. Roy stood up, his knees protesting. But you're in no shape to go anywhere today. Weather report says another storm's coming in tonight. You can rest here until you're stronger, and then you can make your own choices. I can't stay here. Why not? Because... She stopped, the words catching in her throat. Her hands twisted in the blanket, and Roy saw her fighting some internal battle. Because people who help me end up regretting it. The rawness in her voice told Roy more than any explanation could have. This woman was carrying damage, the kind that went deeper than cold exposure and bruised skin. He recognized it because he'd been carrying his own damage for 5 years. I'll take my chances, he said quietly. You can have the spare room. It's small, but it's warm. There's a bathroom down the hall. I'll make some food. Roy, no arguments. You're staying at least until tomorrow morning. After that, if you still want to leave, I won't stop you. He moved toward the door, then paused. But I will tell you that running in winter without proper gear is a good way to die. And I don't think you really want to die. I think you just want to stop hurting. Grace stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded once, a small movement that seemed to cost her something. Roy went to the kitchen and started pulling things from the refrigerator. Eggs, bread, cheese, simple food that would be easy on a stomach that probably hadn't eaten properly in days. As he cooked, he could hear Mercy moving around in the living room, the soft sound of her hooves on the hardwood floor. He'd let her stay inside for now. She'd earned it. The eggs sizzled in the pan, and Roy found himself thinking about the last time he'd cooked for someone other than himself. Jennifer's last visit, maybe. Or no, it had been even longer than that. Since Sarah died, he'd eaten mechanically, rarely tasting what he consumed. Food was fuel, nothing more, but cooking for Grace felt different. It had purpose beyond mere sustenance. When he brought the plate to the living room, Grace was sitting upright, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. She'd found the paperback he'd pulled from her pack and was holding it like it was precious. The cover was so worn he couldn't read the title. Mary Oliver, Grace said, noticing his glance. Poetry. I've read this book probably 100 times. Roy set the plate on the coffee table. Sarah liked poetry, had a whole shelf of it. I never understood most of it, but she'd read passages to me sometimes. Sarah was your wife? Yeah. He twisted the ring on his finger. She passed 5 years ago. Grace looked around the room with new understanding, taking in the feminine touches that Roy had preserved. The curtains, the decorative pillows, the framed photographs on the mantel. I'm sorry, she said, and something in her voice suggested she understood that kind of loss. Eat, Roy said, deflecting. We can talk after you've got some food in you. She picked up the fork hesitantly, as if afraid the food might be taken away. The first bite seemed to unlock something, and she ate steadily, not rushing but not stopping either. Roy watched from his chair, noting the way her shoulders gradually relaxed, the way color continued to return to her face. When she'd finished, she set the plate aside and met his eyes. "I haven't been completely honest with you," I figured. "I'm not just passing through. She stopped, choosing her words carefully. "I'm trying to disappear." "From what? From who?" Grace pulled the blanket tighter. "My husband. Ex-husband. The divorce has been final for 6 months, but he won't let it be final. He keeps finding me. Every town, every job, every place I try to start over. He finds me." Roy felt a cold anger settle in his chest. The bruises on her jaw made more sense now. "He hurt you. For 23 years. Her voice was matter-of-fact, almost detached. "I finally left when I realized it wasn't going to stop. Filed for divorce, got a restraining order, did everything the law says you're supposed to do. But paper doesn't stop someone like Malcolm. Where is he? Now, I don't know. That's what scares me. He found me in Billings 2 weeks ago, waited outside my apartment, told me all the things he was going to do if I didn't come home. I left that night with whatever I could carry and started moving, bus to bus, town to town. I thought maybe if I got remote enough, rural enough, he wouldn't bother following." She laughed bitterly. "Then I got off in Choteau and realized how stupid that was. There's nowhere remote enough, nowhere safe enough. So I just started walking, thinking maybe the cold would make the decision for me." Roy was quiet for a long moment, processing. This woman had been prepared to die rather than face whatever her ex-husband had planned for her. The depth of that desperation was almost incomprehensible. "You're safe here," he said finally. "You can't promise that." "Maybe not, but I can promise that nobody's going to hurt you under my roof. And if this Malcolm shows up, he'll find it's a lot harder to bully someone when they're not alone." Grace shook her head. "You don't understand. Malcolm he's not just violent. He's smart, methodical. He was a detective for 20 years before he retired. He knows how to find people, how to manipulate systems, how to make you feel like there's no escape. Then, it's a good thing you found a place he doesn't know about. How would he even connect you to my ranch?" "I don't know," Grace admitted, "but he always finds a way." Roy stood up, his decision made. "Well, until he does or doesn't, you're welcome to stay. I've got a spare room that hasn't been used in years. You can rest, recover, and figure out your next move. No obligations, no expectations, just a warm place to sleep and regular meals." "Why would you do that for a stranger?" He thought about it, really thought about the answer. "Because my wife would have wanted me to, and because I know what it's like to feel like there's nothing left worth living for. If I can give you a little time to find a reason to keep going, seems like the least I can do." Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "I can't pay you, didn't ask you to, and if he comes, we'll deal with it if it happens." Roy picked up the empty plate. "For now, let's get you settled in that spare room. You look like you need about 12 hours of sleep." She didn't argue this time. As Roy helped her to her feet, steadying her when she swayed, Mercy watched from her spot by the fire. The donkey's dark eyes seemed knowing, almost approving. In that moment, as he guided a broken stranger down the hallway of his too-quiet house, Roy felt something he hadn't felt in 5 years. Purpose. The weight of it was both frightening and oddly welcome, like waking from a long sleep to find the world still turning. He showed Grace the spare room, Sarah's sewing room once, now just empty space with a bed and a dresser, and left her to rest. As he closed the door, he heard her voice, soft and uncertain. "Roy, thank you for not letting me die." "You're welcome," he said. "Now get some sleep." He walked back to the living room, where Mercy still kept watch by the dying fire. Roy sat down heavily in his chair and looked at the wedding ring on his finger. The familiar weight of it felt different now, like maybe it wasn't just a monument to the past anymore. Maybe it was a reminder that he'd once known how to care about someone other than himself. And maybe, just maybe, he could learn how to do that again. Grace slept for 14 hours straight. Roy checked on her twice, opening the door just enough to confirm she was still breathing. The second time, he left a glass of water on the nightstand and one of Sarah's old sweaters folded on the chair. When she finally emerged the next morning, the predicted storm had arrived. Snow fell in thick curtains outside the windows, already accumulating several inches. Grace stood in the kitchen doorway, wearing the sweater over her own thin clothes, looking uncertain about whether she belonged there. "Coffee?" Roy offered, gesturing to the pot on the counter. "Please." Her voice was hoarse from sleep. He poured her a cup and pushed the sugar bowl across the table. They sat in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the wind rattling the windows and the old house settling around them. It should have been awkward, but somehow it wasn't. The quiet felt natural, two people too tired for small talk. "Storm's supposed to last through tomorrow," Roy said finally. "You're stuck here whether you like it or not." Grace looked out at the falling snow. "Malcolm would never think to look for me somewhere like this. He'd expect me to hide in a city. Crowds, anonymity. But you came to the middle of nowhere instead. I got tired of crowds, tired of looking over my shoulder in grocery stores and parking lots. Out here," she paused, searching for words. "Out here, at least I can see trouble coming from a distance." Roy nodded. It made a certain kind of sense. "Well, there's not much to see at the moment except snow. You feel up to eating something more substantial than eggs." "I don't want to be a burden." "You're not. But I'm making breakfast anyway, so you might as well eat." He pulled out Sarah's recipe box from the cabinet, where it had sat untouched for years. The wood was smooth under his fingers, darkened with age and use. Sarah had kept every recipe that mattered to her in this box, written in her precise handwriting on index cards yellowed with time. Grace watched him with quiet curiosity as he flipped through the cards. "Your wife's recipes?" "Yeah, she was a good cook. Better than me, anyway." His fingers found the card. He was looking for her buttermilk pancakes. "Haven't made these since she passed." "You don't have to." "I want to." And surprisingly, he meant it. The familiar motions of measuring and mixing brought back memories. Sarah at this same counter, flour dusting her hands, humming while she didn't worked. How many Saturday mornings had started exactly like this? How many times had he sat at the table reading the paper while she made pancakes? Grace seemed to sense his thoughts. She stayed quiet, sipping her coffee, giving him space with his memories. When Roy set the plate in front of her 20 minutes later, she looked at the pancakes like they might disappear if she blinked. They look perfect. Sarah would say they need another 30 seconds on the griddle, but close enough. They ate together, and Roy noticed Grace was more relaxed than she'd been yesterday. The sleep and warmth had done her good. The bruises on her jaw were more visible now, faded but still present, a reminder of what she'd survived. "Can I ask you something?" Grace said, setting down her fork. "Go ahead. Why do you still wear the ring?" Roy glanced at the gold band on his finger. "Habit, mostly. Wore it for 37 years. Feels wrong not to wear it. Do you think she'd want you to?" The question caught him off guard. "I don't know. We never talked about it. Never really thought one of us would be without the other for this long." He twisted the ring absently. "What about you? Still wearing yours?" Grace held up her left hand. The finger, where a ring should have been, showed a faint indentation, but no band. "Threw it in a river outside of Billings. Felt good at the time. Now I'm not sure what it accomplished. Sometimes the symbolic gestures matter more than we think." "Maybe." She looked at him thoughtfully. "You loved her very much." "Still do." The admission came easily. "That doesn't stop just because someone's gone." "No," Grace said softly. "I suppose it doesn't." After breakfast, Roy showed Grace around the house properly. It wasn't a grand tour. The place was small, built for function rather than show. But she seemed interested in the details. The photographs on the mantel, the books on the shelves, the view from each window. She paused at a picture of Roy and Sarah from their wedding day. They looked impossibly young, faces smooth and bright with hope. "How old were you?" Grace asked. 23. Sarah was 21. Her father thought we were too young, that we should wait. But we knew. Roy smiled at the memory. "Sometimes you just know." "I thought I knew too," Grace said. "Malcolm was charming when we met. Attentive. Made me feel like I was the only person in the world who mattered. I thought that was love. When did it change?" Gradually. So gradually I didn't notice at first. Little comments about my friends, my choices, my appearance. Then the isolation started moving away from my family, discouraging my career plans. By the time the physical violence started, I was already so cut off from everything that I didn't know how to ask for help. Roy felt anger tightening in his chest again, but he kept his voice calm. How long since you left? 8 months. The divorce was final 6 months ago, but he won't accept it. In his mind, I'm still his property. She wrapped her arms around herself. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever really be free of him. You will be, Roy said with certainty. Might take time, might take distance, but eventually he'll move on to something else. Men like that, their attention span for control only lasts as long as you're accessible. You sound like you know something about it. Had a neighbor once, years back. Similar situation. Her husband made her life hell for a while, but she stuck it out, stayed away from him, and eventually he found someone else to torment. Not saying that's right or fair, but it's what happened. Grace nodded slowly. I hope you're right. The storm intensified throughout the day, wind howling around the eaves and snow piling against the windows. Roy went out twice to check on the animals, coming back both times covered in snow and half frozen. Grace had coffee waiting for him the second time, and he was surprised by how natural it felt to have someone anticipating his needs. The cattle all right? She asked, as he peeled off his wet coat. Yeah, they're tough. Got good shelter in the barn. He warmed his hands around the coffee mug. Mercy's loving all the attention. I think she's showing off for you. She's a remarkable animal. The way she found me, it's like she knew exactly where to look. Sarah always said Mercy had a sixth sense about things. I used to think that was romantic nonsense, but I'm not so sure anymore. They spent the afternoon in companionable silence. Roy worked on paperwork at the kitchen table, bills, ranch records, things he'd been putting off. Grace read her worn poetry book, occasionally looking up to watch the snow fall. It struck Roy how easy this was. No pressure to make conversation, no awkward attempts to fill the silence. Just two people sharing space, both comfortable with their own thoughts. Around dinner time, Grace stood up and stretched. Can I help with something? Cooking? Cleaning? Anything? I feel useless just sitting here, Roy considered. Can you cook? I managed to feed myself and Malcolm for 23 years, so I'd say yes. All right then. There's chicken in the fridge and vegetables in the bin. Surprise me. He watched as Grace moved around the kitchen with purpose, her earlier hesitation gone. She found what she needed without asking, worked efficiently, seemed to know her way around a stove. Within an hour, the house smelled like roasted chicken and herbs. They ate at the table, the storm still raging outside. The food was good, better than good. Roy couldn't remember the last time he'd had a proper meal that wasn't reheated leftovers or something thrown together from cans. This is excellent, he said. Grace smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. Cooking was one of the few things Malcolm never criticized. He liked good food too much. Well, his loss is my gain. After dinner, they cleaned up together. Roy washed, Grace dried, and they worked in the same easy rhythm they'd found earlier. When everything was put away, Grace excused herself to her room, and Roy was left alone in the quiet house. He sat in his chair by the fire, Mercy dozing at his feet, and thought about how much had changed in just 2 days. His carefully ordered solitude had been disrupted by a stranger with haunted eyes and capable hands. He should have resented the intrusion. Instead, he felt something he'd almost forgotten. The house felt lived in again. The kitchen held the smell of someone else's cooking. There were sounds besides his own footsteps and the creaking of old wood. It felt like life instead of mere existence. Roy twisted his wedding ring and spoke to the empty room. I know what you're thinking, Sarah, and maybe you're right. Maybe I did need this. The fire crackled in response, and outside the storm continued its assault on the Montana prairie. But inside, for the first time in 5 years, Roy Callahan felt something other than alone. The storm broke on the third morning, leaving behind a world transformed. Snow lay 3 feet deep across the pastures, sculpted by wind into fantastic drifts that reached the fence rails. The sky was crystalline blue, so bright it hurt to look at without squinting. Roy was up before dawn, preparing for the work ahead. Digging out from a storm like this took time and effort, and he wasn't getting any younger. He was surprised to find Grace already in the kitchen, dressed in layers of his old work clothes that swallowed her smaller frame. "I want to help," she said before he could object. "It's hard work, cold work. I grew up in North Dakota. I know what cold work is." She met his eyes steadily. "I need to do something useful, Roy. I can't just sit inside while you're out there breaking your back." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right, but we take breaks when we need them. No heroics." They started with the barn, shoveling a path wide enough for the undone animals to move freely. Grace worked steadily, her breath forming white clouds in the frozen air. She didn't complain, didn't slow down, just kept the shovel moving in a rhythm that spoke of practice. "You weren't kidding about North Dakota," Roy said during their first break. "Farm girl, born and raised. Left when I married Malcolm, thought I was escaping to something better." She leaned on her shovel. "Turns out there are worse things than early mornings and hard work." They continued clearing paths throughout the morning to the water troughs, around the barn doors, from the house to the generator shed. The physical labor felt good, purposeful. Roy found himself moving better than he had in months, his body responding to having a partner in the work. Around noon they stopped for lunch. Grace made sandwiches while Roy started a fresh pot of coffee. They ate standing up, too tired to bother with sitting down properly. "How much more?" Grace asked. "The worst is done. Just need to check on the far pasture this afternoon, make sure the cattle can reach their shelter." "I'll come with you." They took the old ATV, a battered four-wheeler that Roy kept for exactly these situations. Grace rode behind him, holding on as they bounced across the snow-covered terrain. The cattle were fine, huddled together in the lee of the barn, their thick coats protection against the cold. On the ride back, something shifted. Maybe it was the shared work, or the way Grace had proven herself capable, or simply the effect of the brilliant winter sun on the endless white landscape. Roy found himself talking in a way he hadn't in years. "Sarah and I used to do this together," he said over the engine noise. "Every storm, we'd dig out side by side. She was tougher than she looked. Outworked me half the time." "What was she like?" Grace asked. Roy thought about it as they crested a ridge. Practical, kind. She had this way of seeing what needed doing and just doing it, no fuss. But she was. Also, she had this lightness about her. Could find joy in small things. A good sunset, fresh bread, a joke on the radio. I always thought that was her gift, finding happiness in ordinary moments. You must miss that, every day. He navigated around a deep drift. The silence is the hardest part. Not just the literal quiet, though that's bad enough. It's the absence of shared experience. You see something beautiful or funny or strange, and there's no one to turn to and say, "Did you see that?" It makes everything feel less real. Grace was quiet for a moment. "I know what you mean. Different reason, but I know what you mean. Malcolm isolated me so thoroughly that even when I was surrounded by people, I felt alone. At least now, my aloneness is honest." When they got back to the house, both were exhausted but satisfied. Grace headed for the shower first, and Roy tended to Mercy, who'd spent the day in her stall watching the snow with what he swore was disdain. "Not a fan of winter, are you, girl?" He scratched behind her ears. "Can't say I blame you." That evening, after another of Grace's excellent dinners, they sat in the living room with the fire going. Roy had found an old jigsaw puzzle in the closet, 1,000 pieces depicting a Montana landscape. Sarah had loved puzzles but never finished this one. "Want to help?" he asked Grace. "I haven't done a puzzle in 20 years. Good time to start again then." They worked on it together, sorting edge pieces and sections by color. The activity gave their hands something to do while they talked, making the conversation feel easier somehow. "Can I ask you something personal?" Grace said, fitting 2 pieces of sky together. "Sure." Do you have children? One daughter, Jennifer. She lives in Seattle with her husband and 2 kids. Roy found a corner piece. She wanted me to move out there after Sarah died. Sell the ranch, get a condo near them, be the involved grandpa. But you didn't want to? Couldn't. This place, it's not just a ranch. It's every memory I have of Sarah, every fence we mended, every tree we planted, every room we painted together. Leaving would feel like abandoning her. He paused. Jennifer doesn't understand that. She thinks I'm being stubborn. Maybe you are, Grace said gently. But I also think grief doesn't follow anyone else's timeline. You'll know when you're ready to let go, if you ever are. What about you? Any kids? Grace's expression tightened. No. Malcolm didn't want them. Said they'd interfere with our life together. Looking back, I think he just didn't want to share control over anyone else. She found 2 pieces that matched. Sometimes I regret that. But mostly I'm grateful I didn't bring children into that situation. They continued working on the puzzle in comfortable silence. Outside, the temperature was dropping again, the clear sky promising another bitter night. But inside, the fire kept the cold at bay. Roy got up to add another log, and he noticed the old drawer in the side table was slightly open. On impulse, he pulled it all the way out and found the harmonica he'd forgotten he owned. Silver, tarnished now, but still solid. I haven't played this in probably 15 years, he said, turning it over in his hands. Why not? Sarah used to ask me to play, said it reminded her of her grandfather. After she died, I just couldn't. Grace watched him thoughtfully. Maybe you could now. Roy hesitated, then brought the harmonica to his lips. The first notes were shaky, uncertain. But muscle memory took over, and soon he was playing an old folk tune his own father had taught him. The music filled the room, simple and sweet and achingly nostalgic. When he finished, Grace had tears in her eyes. That was beautiful, out of practice. No, it was perfect. She wiped her eyes. Thank you for sharing that. Roy set the harmonica on the table between them, feeling oddly lighter. Thank you for asking me to. They returned to the puzzle, but something had shifted again. The walls they'd each built around themselves had developed a few more cracks. Not broken, not yet, but definitely weakened. Later, as Grace said goodnight and headed to her room, she paused in the doorway. Roy, I know I haven't said it enough, but thank you for everything, for saving my life, for giving me a place to recover, for treating me like a person instead of a problem to be solved. You're welcome. And Grace, thank you for being here. I didn't realize how much I needed. He stopped, searching for the right words. How much I needed to remember what it feels like to not be alone. She smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. Good night, Roy. Good night. After she'd gone, Roy sat with the puzzle and his harmonica, looking around the room that suddenly felt less like a shrine and more like a home. Mercy had claimed her spot by the fire, perfectly content. You knew, didn't you? Roy said to the donkey. When you led me to her, you knew this was what I needed. Mercy's ear twitched, but she didn't open her eyes. Roy picked up the harmonica again and played another song, this one a lullaby Sarah used to hum while she worked. The notes drifted through the old house, carrying memories but also something new, the possibility that life might still hold surprises worth living for. Outside, stars emerged in the frozen sky, brilliant and infinite. Inside, 2 people who'd thought themselves beyond saving had begun, tentatively, to hope again. A week passed, then 2. The days fell into a rhythm that felt both new and ancient, like something they'd been doing forever. Roy handled the morning chores while Grace made breakfast. They'd worked together on ranch tasks during the day, then shared dinner in the evening, often working on the puzzle or simply reading in companionable silence. Grace proved herself invaluable. She could handle tools, understood animals, and had a practical approach to problems that Roy appreciated. More than that, she brought her energy to the place that had been missing. The house felt occupied instead of haunted. But there were moments when Roy would catch her staring out the window with an expression of deep worry, or would hear her pacing her room late at night. The fear hadn't left her. It just hid beneath the surface, waiting for any excuse to resurface. It came to a head on a Tuesday morning when Roy went to town for supplies. He'd asked Grace if she wanted to come along, but she'd declined, saying she'd rather stay and work on organizing the storage shed. What he didn't expect was to return and find her in the barn, sitting in the corner of Mercy's stall, trembling so hard she could barely speak. "Grace!" He approached slowly, carefully. "What happened?" There was a car, her voice was barely a whisper, coming up the road. I saw the dust from the window and I couldn't breathe. I thought it was him. I thought he'd found me. Roy knelt beside her, his knees protesting the position. Who was it? Jim Hendricks from the neighboring ranch. He was just turning around, using our drive. But for those few minutes, she wrapped her arms around herself. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. I was back in Billings, back in that apartment, watching Malcolm's car pull up and knowing what was coming. "Grace, you're safe here." "Am I?" She looked at him with eyes full of anguish. "Or am I just waiting for the inevitable? He's found me everywhere else. Why would here be any different?" Roy sat down beside her, the hay dusty beneath them. Mercy watched from her feed bucket, chewing thoughtfully. "Tell me about him. Really tell me. What am I dealing with if he shows up?" Grace took a shaky breath. Malcolm Stewart, 63 years old, retired detective from the Billings Police Department. 22 years on the force, specialized in tracking down fugitives. He's intelligent, methodical, and absolutely convinced that I belong to him. The police won't help? He knows too many people, has too many friends in law enforcement. The restraining order I got, he laughed at it. Told me that piece of paper meant nothing, that he'd taught guys like the judge I stood in front of how to process domestic complaints. She pulled her knees to her chest, and he was careful, so careful. For years, he never left marks where anyone could see, never hit me where it would show. The bruises you saw when you found me, those only happened because I fought back for the first time. Roy felt his anger building, but he kept his voice level. "How did you finally get away?" "A neighbor heard me screaming one night, called 911, even though I begged her not to. When the patrol officers showed up, Malcolm was charming. Said we'd had an argument, that I was emotional, that everything was fine, but one of the officers was young, new. She looked at me, really looked at me and saw through it. She gave me a card for a domestic violence shelter. While Malcolm was in the bathroom, Grace wiped her eyes. I called them the next day when he went to a poker game. They helped me disappear, get to a safe house, file the divorce papers. But Malcolm, he took it as a personal challenge, like I was a case he needed to solve. Has he threatened you directly? Not in ways that would hold up in court. He's too smart for that. But the implications are clear. Last time he found me, he stood outside my apartment and described every detail of my day. Where I'd gone, who I'd talked to, what I'd bought at the grocery store, proving he could track my every move. Her voice dropped lower. Then he said that I'd clearly forgotten who I belonged to, but he'd be happy to remind me. Roy was quiet for a long moment, processing. "You think he'll keep looking?" "I know he will. Malcolm doesn't quit. It's what made him good at his job. He'd track a suspect for months, years even, until he got his man. I'm just another target to him now, except you're not a criminal. You're a woman who left an abusive marriage. In Malcolm's mind, I'm the one who broke the law. I violated our marriage vows, took what was his. In his worldview, I'm the criminal." Roy stood up slowly, his mind working through the problem like he would any ranch crisis. "All right, here's what we're going to do. First, we're going to install some better security. Motion sensors on the driveway, maybe some cameras. I've got an old hunting rifle in the house, and I'm getting it out of storage. Not looking for a fight, but I believe in being prepared. Roy, I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm offering." He extended his hand to help her up. "Second, you're going to teach me everything you know about Malcolm, his patterns, his methods, his habits. If he does show up, I want to know what I'm dealing with." Grace took his hand and stood. "Why are you doing this? You barely know me. I know enough." I know you're a good person who got dealt a bad hand. I know you work hard, you're kind to my animals, and you make the best chicken I've ever tasted." He managed a small smile. "And I know what it's like to feel helpless. After Sarah died, I felt like the whole world was out of my control. If I can give you back even a little bit of control, seems worth doing." Grace's eyes filled with tears again, but this time she let them fall. "I don't deserve this kindness." "Yes, you do. And Grace, you're stronger than you think. You got yourself out of that situation. You're still here, still fighting. That takes courage most people never have to find." She nodded, wiping her face with the back of her hand. Okay, we'll do it your way. But if things get dangerous, if he shows up and it gets bad, you have to promise me you'll let me leave. I won't let you get hurt because of my problems. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. For now, let's focus on making this place as secure as we can." Roy started toward the barn door, then paused. "And Grace, you're not alone in this anymore. Whatever comes, we face it together." As they walked back to the house, Roy's mind was already working through the practical steps. He'd need to drive into Choteau tomorrow, pick up some equipment. Maybe talk to Sheriff Patterson, feel out whether Malcolm had made any inquiries about the area. It was possible they had more time than Grace feared, but even as he planned, Roy felt a weight settling on his shoulders. He'd invited Grace to stay, offered her protection, made promises about keeping her safe. Now, he needed to figure out how to actually do that if a trained detective with a vendetta came looking. That evening, they sat at the kitchen table with coffee and a notepad. Grace described Malcolm in detail, his appearance, his habits, his likely approach if he tracked her here. Roy took notes, asked questions, tried to understand the mind of a man who would dedicate himself to terrorizing his ex-wife. "He'll start by making inquiries," Grace explained. "Casual questions in bars, gas stations, anywhere locals gather. He's good at seeming friendly, like he's just a concerned ex, looking to make sure his wife is okay. People talk to him. Would he use your real name? Probably. Or he might say, 'He's looking for a woman matching my description.' Show a photo, say I'm his sister or daughter, something that gets people sympathetic." Roy thought about the small community around Choteau. People were friendly but protective of their own. Still, Malcolm sounded like he knew how to manipulate social situations. "We should probably let a few key people know you're here. The sheriff, maybe Jim Hendricks next door. Give them a heads up that if anyone comes asking questions, they should call me first." That could backfire. The more people who know, the more chances for information to leak. True, but it also means more eyes watching out for you. Roy tapped his pen on the notepad. "I'll be selective about who I tell. People I trust, absolutely." They continued planning late into the night, working through scenarios and strategies. When Grace finally went to bed, she looked exhausted but also relieved, as if sharing the burden had made it more bearable. Roy stayed up a while longer, looking out the window at the dark prairie. Somewhere out there, a dangerous man might be searching for the woman sleeping in Roy's spare room. The thought should have frightened him. Instead, it ignited something he hadn't felt in years, a fierce protectiveness, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. Grace needed him. That simple fact had awakened something in Roy that had been dormant since Sarah's death. He touched his wedding ring, then looked at his rough, work-worn hands. These hands had built fences, delivered calves, held his dying wife. They weren't young hands anymore, but they were still strong. Strong enough to protect someone who needed protecting. Strong enough to stand between Grace and whatever darkness was, hunting her. "I hope you approve, Sarah," he said quietly to the empty room, "because I'm all in now." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. But inside, Roy Callahan sat straighter, shoulders set, ready for whatever came next. Roy drove into Choteau the next morning, leaving Grace with specific instructions to keep the doors locked and Mercy close. The hardware store had most of what he needed: motion sensor lights, a wireless camera system, extra deadbolts. The young clerk, Tommy Dixon, raised an eyebrow at the purchases but didn't ask questions. At the sheriff's office, Roy found Bill Patterson behind his desk, working through paperwork with the enthusiasm of a man facing a root canal. "Roy Callahan." Bill stood up, extending a hand. "Haven't seen you in town for months. Everything all right at the ranch?" "Mostly." Roy closed the office door behind him. "Got a situation I need to discuss with you, confidentially." Bill's expression sharpened. He'd been sheriff for 15 years and knew when something serious was coming. "Sit down. Talk to me." Roy explained the situation carefully, leaving out nothing important. Grace's history with Malcolm, the restraining order, her fear that he'd track her to Montana. Bill listened without interrupting, his face growing graver as the story unfolded. "Malcolm Stewart," Bill said when Roy finished. "I know that name. He worked a few cases that crossed into our jurisdiction back when I was a deputy. Good investigator by all accounts. But I remember hearing rumors that he was intense, took things personally. Grace says he's obsessed with finding her. Has he made contact with any law enforcement agencies up here? Filed a missing person report, anything like that? Not that Grace knows of, but she thinks he'll come eventually." Bill leaned back in his chair, thinking, "Here's the thing, Roy. If he shows up and hasn't done anything illegal in Montana, there's not much I can do. The restraining order from Billings doesn't automatically transfer here. She'd need to file for one in our jurisdiction. Would that help, or just tell him where she is?" "That's the catch. Court records are public in most cases." Bill rubbed his jaw. "But if she files and he violates it here, I can arrest him. Otherwise, my hands are tied unless he actually commits a crime. What if he just shows up at my ranch? Your property, your right to tell him to leave. If he refuses, that's trespassing, and I can help with that." Bill met Roy's eyes. "But Roy, if this guy is what Grace says he is, you need to be careful. Domestic situations can turn violent fast. I've seen it too many times. I appreciate the concern. But I'm not planning on turning her away." "Didn't think you would." Bill pulled out a form. "Let's get Grace's information on file officially. That way, if anything happens, we've got documentation of her concerns. And I'll keep an eye out for any out-of-state law enforcement inquiries about women, matching her description." Roy provided what details he could, then headed back to the ranch. The drive gave him time to think. Bill was right. This could get dangerous. Malcolm sounded like a man who'd invested his identity in control, and people like that didn't respond well to being defied. But Roy had meant what he said. He wasn't turning Grace away. Back at the ranch, he found her in the kitchen with flour dusting her hands and something wonderful smelling in the oven. She looked up when he entered, anxiety clear in her expression. "How did it go?" "Bill's aware of the situation. He'll keep watch for any inquiries." Roy set down his bags of supplies. "He also suggested you file for a restraining order here, but we agreed that might do more harm than good right now." Grace nodded slowly. "Probably wise. The less official record of my location, the better." They spent the afternoon installing the security measures. Motion sensors along the driveway, cameras covering the main part, approaches to the house, new locks on all the doors. Grace worked alongside him, handing him tools and holding the ladder steady. "You're good at this," Roy observed as she helped him wire the last camera. "Malcolm was fanatical about home security when we were married. Cameras everywhere, always monitoring, always watching. He claimed it was about keeping me safe, but really, it was about keeping tabs on me." She twisted a wire connector tight. "Never thought I'd be grateful for the education." When they finished, Roy showed her how to check the camera feeds on the old computer in his office. "You can see the whole perimeter from here. If anyone comes up the drive, we'll know long before they reach the house." "Thank you, Roy, for all of this. Just being practical." He paused, then added, "and maybe a little protective. Fair warning, it's been a while since I had anyone to protect, so I might overdo it." Grace smiled. "I think I can live with that." That evening, while Roy was outside doing the final check on the animals, Grace found herself drawn to the bookshelf in the living room. Most of the titles were practical ranch management, cattle breeding, equipment maintenance. But one shelf held different books: poetry, literary fiction, memoirs. Sarah's books, clearly. Behind a volume of Robert Frost, Grace found a leather-bound journal. She almost put it back, unwilling to intrude on private memories. But it fell open in her hands, and her eyes caught on a sentence. "Roy has the best heart of any man I've ever known." She should have closed it, should have put it back, but she kept reading. The journal entries were dated from Sarah's final year, short observations mostly about daily life on the ranch. But woven through them were reflections on Roy, his kindness, his steady presence, his quiet strength. And in one entry from 2 months before Sarah's death, words that made Grace's breath catch. "I worry about Roy after I'm gone. He's never been good at being alone. He needs someone to care for, something beyond just the ranch and the animals. I hope he finds that again. He deserves to have someone who appreciates what a rare and good man he is. I hope he doesn't lock himself away in grief. There's too much love left in him to waste." Grace closed the journal carefully, her hands trembling. Sarah had known, had understood her husband well enough to predict exactly what would happen after her death. Roy, withdrawing, isolating, turning the ranch into a monastery of memory. But she'd hoped for something different. She'd hoped Roy would find connection again. Grace was still holding the journal when Roy came back inside, stomping snow from his boots. He saw what she was holding and froze. "I'm sorry," Grace said immediately. "I found it on the shelf and I shouldn't have." "It's all right." Roy hung up his coat slowly. "What did you read?" "Just a few entries. Roy, Sarah wrote about you with such love, and she hoped you'd find someone again, someone to care for." Roy was quiet for a long moment. Then he moved to the chair by the fire and sat down heavily. "She told me the same thing near the end. Said she didn't want me turning into a hermit. I told her I'd be fine, that I'd keep living my life. But we both knew I was lying." Grace sat across from him, the journal still in her hands. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman." She was. Smart, capable, warm, everything I wasn't. "I always wondered what she saw in a beat-up rancher like me." He smiled sadly. "But she chose me anyway, and I tried my best to deserve that choice every day we had together. You succeeded. That's clear from everything she wrote." Roy looked at Grace, really looked at her, and something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words. They were both scarred, both carrying losses that had reshaped them, but they were also both still here, still capable of connection despite everything. "I think Sarah would have liked you," Roy said quietly. "She had a soft spot for people who'd been through hard times. Said it gave them character. I would have liked her too. Anyone who could love you this well must have been special." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning neither of them was quite ready to examine. Grace stood up, suddenly flustered, and placed the journal back on the shelf. "I should start dinner," she said. "Grace, it's all right, Roy. I understand." She managed to smile. "And for what it's worth, I think you're doing exactly what Sarah hoped you'd do. You're caring for someone who needs it. You're opening your heart again, even if you don't realize it yet." She left the room before he could respond, leaving Roy alone with his thoughts and the ghost of his wife's hopes for him. Later that night, after Grace had gone to bed, Roy pulled out the journal and read through it himself. Sarah's words felt like a gift and a challenge both. She'd known him so well, had understood that his greatest strength, his capacity for devotion, could also be his greatest weakness if turned inward. She'd been telling him to live, to keep caring, to find purpose beyond just maintaining the ranch, and somehow, through a combination of Mercy's intuition and Grace's desperate need, he'd been given that chance. Roy closed the journal and set it on the table beside his chair. The house was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the hollow silence of isolation, but the peaceful quiet of companionship. Grace was asleep down the hall. Mercy was dozing by the fire. The cameras watched the perimeter. The motion sensors stood ready. They were preparing for a threat that might never come. But even if Malcolm never found them, something had already changed. Roy had stepped out of his grief-built fortress and let someone in, and he found he didn't regret it. Not one bit. 3 weeks had passed since Grace collapsed at Roy's gate. 3 weeks of growing, comfortable, of routines that felt almost normal, of guards slowly lowering. They'd kept the security measures active, checked the cameras regularly, stayed vigilant. But as days became weeks with no sign of Malcolm, it became easier to hope he'd given up, moved on, or simply failed to pick up her trail. That hope died on a Friday afternoon when the motion sensor on the driveway chimed. Grace was in the kitchen making bread, her hands dusted with flour. Roy was in the barn repairing a broken fence post. The chime from the computer in the office was quiet, but Grace heard it. She froze, her heart immediately racing. It could be nothing. Jim Hendricks turning around again. A delivery truck that took a wrong turn. Any number of innocent explanations. But when she pulled up the camera feed, her worst fear materialized on the screen. A dark blue sedan was making its way up the long driveway. And behind the wheel, even through the grainy camera image, she recognized the set of those shoulders, the shape of that head. Malcolm. Grace's legs almost gave out. She gripped the desk for support, her breathing coming in short gasps. He'd found her. After 3 weeks of peace, of beginning to feel safe, Malcolm had tracked her to the one place she'd thought might be beyond his reach. She had maybe 2 minutes before he reached the house. Grace ran to the barn, her legs shaking so badly she nearly fell twice. Roy looked up from his work when she burst through the door, and his expression immediately shifted from surprise to alarm. "He's here." The words came out strangled. "Malcolm, he's coming up the drive." Roy dropped his tools and moved fast for a 70-year-old man. "Get inside. Lock the doors. Stay away from the windows. I'll handle this." "Roy, you don't understand. He's dangerous." "I understand perfectly. Now get inside. Trust me." Grace wanted to argue, wanted to grab Roy and run, wanted to do anything except face what was coming. But the certainty in Roy's... The voice cut through her panic. She ran back to the house, locked the door behind her, and then stood frozen in the kitchen, listening to the sound of tires on gravel growing closer. Roy walked to the front of the house with deliberate calm, placing himself between the approaching vehicle and the front door. His hunting rifle was in the house, but he'd made a conscious choice to leave it there. This needed to be handled carefully, not with weapons. The sedan pulled to a stop, 20 feet away. Roy watched as a man emerged, tall, well-built despite his age, with silver hair and the bearing of someone used to command. He wore slacks and a dress shirt despite the cold, and his eyes swept the property with professional assessment. This was Malcolm Stewart, and Roy understood immediately why Grace had been so afraid. There was something in the man's posture, in the way he moved, that spoke of absolute confidence in his right to be here, to demand answers, to take what he believed was his. It was the stance of someone who'd never been told no in a way that mattered. "Can I help you?" Roy called out, his voice level and calm. Malcolm approached with his hands visible, non-threatening, a small smile on his face. Every move calculated to seem reasonable. "I hope so. I'm looking for my wife. I have reason to believe she might have come this way." "Your wife?" "Ex-wife, technically, but in my heart, she'll always be mine." Malcolm pulled out his phone and showed Roy a photograph. It was Grace, smiling in what looked like a family photo from years ago, before the fear had etched permanent lines around her eyes. "Her name is Grace. Grace Stewart. Have you seen her?" Roy studied the photo, then looked back at Malcolm with an expression of polite confusion. "Can't say I have. But I don't see many people out here. Pretty isolated." "I understand. But she's not well. She has some mental health issues, tends to wander, gets confused. I'm very worried about her, especially in this cold." Malcolm's voice was smooth, concerned, perfectly calibrated to generate sympathy. "I've been tracking her movements through various towns, and the trail led here. I'm sorry to hear about your wife's troubles, but I haven't seen anyone matching that description." Malcolm's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened slightly. "Mind if I look around? Just to put my mind at ease?" "Actually, I do mind. This is private property. I understand. But surely you can appreciate a husband's concern for his missing wife?" Malcolm reached into his pocket and pulled out a wallet, flipping it open to show a retired detective's badge. "I was on the force for over 20 years. I know how to conduct a proper search, won't disturb anything." Roy didn't look at the badge. "Retired law enforcement doesn't give you the right to search my property without permission, and I'm not giving permission." For the first time, Malcolm's pleasant facade cracked slightly. "Mister, I didn't catch your beast's name." "Didn't give it. Right. Look, I'm trying to be reasonable here. I'm a worried husband looking for his wife. If you've seen her, and you're hiding her, you need to understand that's interfering with a domestic situation. There are legal consequences for that." "Are there?" Roy's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. "Because, from where I stand, you're a man on my property making vague threats. Now, you've asked your question, and I've given my answer. I think it's time for you to leave." Malcolm's jaw tightened. He studied Roy for a long moment, and Roy had the uncomfortable sensation of being analyzed, categorized, assessed for weaknesses. "You're Roy Callahan," Malcolm said finally, "owner of this ranch for 37 years, widower, one daughter in Seattle. You keep to yourself, barely come into town. People say you're honest, but stubborn." Roy felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Malcolm had done his research, knew exactly who Roy was, which meant he'd likely already confirmed that Grace was here. "Sounds like you've been asking questions about me. Little invasive for a stranger. I'm a detective, was a detective. Research is what I do." Malcolm took a step closer. "Here's what I think, Mr. Callahan. I think Grace is here. I think she fed you some story about me being abusive, about her needing to hide. Grace is very good at playing the victim. It's one of her patterns. If she was here, which I'm not saying she is, maybe she has good reason to hide from you. You don't know what you're dealing with. Grace is manipulative. She'll make you care about her, make you think you're protecting her, when really she's just using you until something better comes along. She's done it before." Roy shook his head slowly. "I've lived 70 years, long enough to know when someone's spinning tales. And right now, all I'm hearing from you is a man who can't accept that his wife left him. That's not my problem. But you being on my property uninvited is." Malcolm's expression went cold, the last pretense of friendliness dropping away. "You're making a mistake, a serious mistake. Grace is my wife, ex-wife, and I will find her. If you're helping her, you're putting yourself in the middle of something you don't understand. I have resources, connections. I can make your life very difficult. Son, I'm 70 years old and I've buried the love of my life. There's not much you can threaten me with that scares me more than what I've already survived." Roy's voice remained steady, but his eyes were hard as stone. "Now get off my property. Don't come back. If you do, I'll call the sheriff and have you arrested for trespassing." For a moment, Malcolm looked like he might escalate. His hands clenched into fists, and Roy saw the violence barely restrained beneath the surface. This was a man used to getting what he wanted, not accustomed to being defied. But then Malcolm's training reasserted itself. He stepped back, the pleasant mask sliding back into place, though his eyes remained cold. "This isn't over," Malcolm said quietly. "Grace can't hide forever. And when I find her, and I will find her, I'll remember everyone who helped her defy me." He walked back to his car with measured steps, got in, and pulled a slow turn before heading back down the driveway. Roy watched until the sedan disappeared from sight, then remained standing there for another 5 minutes, making sure Malcolm was truly gone. Only then did he allow himself to feel the fear that had been building in his chest. Inside the house, Grace was huddled in the corner of the kitchen, her arms wrapped around her knees, tears streaming down her face. She looked up when Roy entered, her expression devastated. "He knows I'm here," she whispered. "You sent him away, but he knows." "Malcolm always knows." Roy knelt beside her, his knees protesting but ignored. "Grace, listen to me. He suspects, but he doesn't know for certain, and even if he did, it doesn't matter. This is my property, and I decide who's welcome here. You don't understand what he's like, what he'll do. He won't just give up and leave. He'll watch, he'll wait, he'll find a way to what? He can't force his way in here. He can't make you leave against your will. And if he tries either of those things, he'll be the one facing legal consequences. Grace shook her head, her whole body trembling. Legal consequences don't scare him. He knows how to work around laws. He spent his whole career doing it. Roy sat down beside her on the floor, his back against the cabinet. Then we'll have to be smarter than him. We knew this might happen. We prepared for it. Now we adapt and keep going. I should leave before he comes back with whatever he's planning. I won't let you get hurt because of me. No, Roy's voice was firm. You're not leaving, and I'm not letting you face him alone. We're past that point, Grace. You're under my protection now. And I don't give up on people I've committed to protecting. She looked at him with red, swollen eyes. Why? Why would you put yourself at risk for me? Roy thought about Sarah's journal, about her hope that he'd find purpose again after her death, about the weeks of companionship that had reminded him what it felt like to care about someone's well-being beyond his own, about the simple fact that this frightened woman deserved better than to spend her life running from a monster. Because it's the right thing to do, he said simply, and because you've reminded me that I still have something worth offering the world. I'm not letting Malcolm take that away from either of us. Grace leaned against him, and Roy put his arm around her shoulders. They sat there on the kitchen floor while the afternoon faded to evening, two people who'd found each other by accident, now bound together by choice. Outside, unknown to them, Malcolm sat in his car a mile down the road, studying the photographs he'd taken of the ranch, of Roy, of every detail that might prove useful. He'd found Grace. He knew she was there, despite the old man's denials, and Malcolm Stewart had never failed to retrieve what belonged to him. The game had entered a new phase, and this time, Malcolm thought with grim satisfaction, he held all the advantages. The first thing Roy did after Malcolm left was call Sheriff Patterson. Bill arrived within the hour, his patrol car kicking up dust on the dry parts of the driveway that the sun had cleared. Roy explained what had happened while Grace sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of tea she wasn't drinking. Bill listened, taking notes, his expression growing more serious as the story unfolded. The problem is, he didn't actually do anything illegal, Bill said when Roy finished. Came onto your property, asked questions, left when you told him to. Technically, he behaved himself. He threatened me, said he'd make my life difficult. That's borderline. But without witnesses or recording, it's your word against his. And unfortunately, he's got a lot of credibility as a retired detective. Bill turned to Grace. Ma'am, I know this is hard, but I need to ask, is there any documented evidence of his abuse? Hospital records, police reports, anything concrete? Grace shook her head. He was too careful for that. For 23 years, he made sure never to leave evidence. What about the restraining order from Billings? It exists, but it's jurisdiction-specific, and Malcolm knows exactly how to stay just on the legal side of things. Bill sighed heavily. I was afraid of that. Look, here's what I can do. I can have a deputy patrol out this way more frequently. I can document today's incident in case it becomes part of a pattern. And if he comes back and you tell him to leave and he doesn't, that's trespassing and I can arrest him for that. That's it? Roy's frustration was evident. Unless he actually commits a crime in my jurisdiction, my hands are tied. Bill looked apologetic. I know that's not what you want to hear. But the law has limits, especially when dealing with someone who knows how to work around it. After Bill left, Roy and Grace sat in heavy silence. The threat that had been theoretical was now real and immediate. Malcolm knew where she was. He'd come once, and he'd come again. I have an idea, Roy said finally. But you're not going to like it. Grace looked up. What? We document everything from now on. Every time he shows up, we record it, video, audio, detailed notes. We build a case that even his connections can't dismiss. Roy, that means letting him come back, letting him get close. I know, but right now we're reacting to him. We need to turn this around, make him the one who's vulnerable. If we can prove a pattern of harassment, stalking, threats, that's something even a retired detective can't talk his way out of. Grace was quiet for a long time, thinking, it's risky. Malcolm is unpredictable when he's challenged, so we make the ranch as secure as we can. We don't take chances, but we also don't run. Roy reached across the table and took her hand. Grace, if we run now, you'll be running forever. He'll know he can push you wherever you go. We need to make a stand. She looked down at their joined hands. Roy's were rough with calluses, marked by decades of hard work. Hers were smaller, softer, but marked with their own scars. Two sets of damaged hands, holding on to each other. All right, she said finally. We make a stand. But Roy, if things get dangerous, really dangerous, you promise me you'll back down. I won't have your blood on my hands. Same goes for you. We protect each other or we don't do this at all. That evening, they reinforced the ranch's security measures. Roy installed better locks on the barn, checked the camera angles to make sure they covered every approach, and brought his hunting rifle out of storage, cleaning and loading it before placing it in the front closet. Grace watched him work with growing anxiety. Have you ever pointed that gun at another person? No, and I hope I never have to. But I believe in being prepared. Roy ran an oiled cloth along the barrel. My father gave me this rifle when I turned 18. Told me it was a tool for feeding your family and protecting what's yours. Nothing more or less. I've used it to hunt deer and elk. Never thought I'd need it for anything else. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old pocket watch, brass and dented. This was his too. He carried it every day of his life. Said it reminded him that time was precious and you had to stand for something before it ran out. He stood up to some men once who were trying to cheat a neighbor out of his land. Risked everything to do what was right. Grace took the watch carefully, feeling its weight. What happened? He won. Not easily. Not without cost. But he won because he refused to. Back down when he knew he was right. Roy took the watch back and slipped it into his pocket. I'm my father's son. And I'm not backing down from Malcolm Stewart. Over the next few days, they settled into a new routine, defined by vigilance. They checked the cameras every few hours. They never went outside without telling the other where they'd be. They kept the doors locked even during daylight. The easy comfort they'd built over the previous weeks was now underlaid with constant tension. But something else was building too, something neither of them wanted to name. The forced proximity, the shared danger, the knowledge that they were trusting each other with their lives. It created an intimacy that went beyond simple companionship. Roy found himself noticing small things. The way Grace tucked her hair behind her ear when she was concentrating, the sound of her humming while she cooked, the rare, genuine smile that transformed her whole face when Mercy did something amusing. Each detail felt precious, worth remembering, worth protecting. Grace noticed things too. The gentle way Roy handled the animals despite his rough exterior. The sadness that still flickered in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. The quiet strength that made her feel safe for the first time in decades. The way he never pushed her to talk about her feelings, but was always there when she needed to. One evening, working together to make dinner, their hands brushed, reaching for the same knife. They both froze, the simple touch suddenly weighted with meaning. Grace pulled back first, her cheeks coloring. Sorry, don't be. Roy's voice was gentle. Grace, I need to say something. And I need you to know I don't expect anything in return. This isn't pressure or obligation or, Roy, you're rambling. He laughed despite himself. Yeah, I am. All right. Straight out then. These past weeks with you here, they've meant something to me. You've meant something to me. More than I expected, more than I thought I was capable of feeling again after Sarah. Grace's breath caught. Roy, I know it's complicated. I know you're dealing with Malcolm and your own healing, and the last thing you need is some old rancher with feelings, but I wanted you to know. You've reminded me that I'm still alive, still capable of caring about someone. Whatever happens with Malcolm, whatever you decide about your future, I'll always be grateful for that. Grace set down the knife she was holding and turned to face him fully. You're not some old rancher. You're the man who saved my life, who gave me shelter when I had nowhere to go, who's willing to stand between me and the person I fear most in the world. Her voice cracked slightly. And I care about you too. More than is probably wise, given everything. So what do we do about it? We survive this first. We make sure Malcolm can't hurt either of us. And then maybe we figure out what comes after. Roy nodded, accepting that. It was enough for now, knowing the feeling was mutual, knowing they were facing the future together rather than separately. The break in tension came 3 days later, on a Tuesday afternoon. Roy was in the barn when he heard Mercy making unusual sounds, not distressed exactly, but insistent. He found the donkey at the barn door, staring toward the southern pasture, with her ears pricked forward. Roy followed her gaze and saw a figure in the distance, standing at the property line. Too far to make out features, but the posture was familiar. Malcolm, watching the ranch through binoculars. Roy's first instinct was anger, a hot flash of protectiveness. But then he remembered what they'd discussed. Document everything, build a case. He pulled out his phone and took several photos, making sure to capture Malcolm's vehicle in the background. Then he called to Grace, who came running from the house. Together, they watched Malcolm watching them. It was a strange standoff, separated by a quarter-mile of Montana prairie. After 10 minutes, Malcolm lowered the binoculars, got in his car, and drove away. But the message was clear. He was still here, still watching, still waiting for his opportunity. He's trying to intimidate us, Grace said, her voice shaking. Make us feel like we're never safe, never private. Then we don't give him the satisfaction of seeing it work. Roy put his arm around her shoulders. We document it, we tell the sheriff, and we keep living our lives. He wants us scared and reactive. We stay calm and methodical. That night, Roy sat at the kitchen table with all the photographs and notes they'd accumulated. Dates, times, Malcolm's appearances, his statements, everything organized and documented. It wasn't much yet, but it was a start. Grace joined him with coffee and Sarah's recipe box. I was thinking we should make cinnamon rolls tomorrow. Sarah has a recipe in here that looks amazing. Roy looked up, surprised. You want to bake cinnamon rolls in the middle of all this? I want to not let Malcolm control every aspect of our lives. If we're always just reacting to him, waiting for him, he's already won. She opened the recipe box and pulled out a card. So, tomorrow, we're making cinnamon rolls. And then maybe we'll work on that puzzle. And in between, we'll keep our eyes open and our defenses strong. But we won't stop living. Roy felt something loosen in his chest. She was right. They couldn't let fear dictate everything. Cinnamon rolls, it is. Later, as Grace headed to bed, she paused in the doorway. Roy, thank you for everything, but especially for treating me like I'm strong enough to face this. Malcolm spent years convincing me I was weak, that I needed him to survive. You've helped me remember that I'm tougher than he ever gave me credit for. You are tough. Toughest person I've known, and that includes my wife, who once delivered a calf in a blizzard while I was laid up with a broken ankle. Grace smiled. I'll take that as a compliment. After she'd gone, Roy remained at the table, Sarah's journal beside him. He opened it to the last entry, written just days before she died. Roy will need to find his way through grief in his own time, but I hope he doesn't lose sight of what a good heart he has. The world needs more men who know how to protect without dominating, to care without smothering. I hope he finds someone who sees that in him. Someone who needs that kind of steadfast devotion as much as he needs someone to give it to. Roy closed the journal and looked toward the hallway where Grace slept. Sarah had been right about so many things. And maybe, just maybe, she'd been right about this too. The threat from Malcolm was real and growing, but so was the bond between Roy and Grace, forged in shared danger and mutual respect. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And that, Roy thought as he finally headed to bed, made all the difference. The confrontation came on a Sunday morning, exactly 1 week after Malcolm's first visit. Roy was in the barn doing early feeding when the motion sensors went off. Not the slow approach of a car this time, but multiple alerts, triggering in sequence someone moving on foot across the property. Roy's blood went cold. He grabbed his phone and called the house. "Grace, we've got movement on the south side. Multiple sensors. Stay inside and lock everything. I'm calling the sheriff." But even as he dialed 911, Roy knew the sheriff's office was 40 minutes away on a good day. Whatever was happening, it would be over long before help arrived. He moved quickly to the house, eyes scanning the property. The morning was grey and overcast, threatening snow, visibility limited by the early hour and heavy clouds. Perfect conditions for someone who didn't want to be seen approaching. Inside, Grace had already locked all the doors and windows. She stood in the kitchen with Roy's rifle in her hands, her face pale but determined. Roy had taught her the basics over the past week, just in case. "Did you see anyone?" she asked. "No, but the sensors don't lie. Someone's out there." Roy pulled up the camera feeds on the computer. "Sheriff's been notified. They're on their way." They watched the screens together, searching for movement. For several minutes there was nothing. Then Grace gasped and pointed. There, by the storage shed, a figure in dark clothing, moving deliberately toward the house. The camera angle wasn't good enough to see the face, but the build and movement were familiar. "Malcolm." The phone rang, making them both jump. Roy answered it. "Hello?" "Roy." Malcolm's voice was calm, reasonable. "We need to talk. Face to face, man to man. I've got nothing to say to you. And the sheriff is on the way." "I know. I called them myself, actually. Reported a trespassing situation at your address. Should create some interesting confusion when they arrive." Roy could hear the smile in Malcolm's voice. "But that gives us about 30 minutes. Plenty of time for a conversation. Stay away from my house. I'm not here to hurt anyone, Roy. I just want what's mine. Send Grace out, and I'll leave peacefully. You'll never see me again." Grace was shaking her head frantically, but Roy had already made his decision. "That's not happening." "Then you're forcing my hand." The reasonable tone dropped away, replaced by cold anger. "I tried to be civilized about this. I gave you chances to do the right thing. But you've chosen to harbor my wife, to interfere in my marriage, to make this personal. Your ex-wife. And she's staying right where she is. We'll see about that." The line went dead. Roy and Grace looked at each other, then back at the screens. Malcolm had disappeared from view. "Where did he go?" Grace whispered. They scanned all the camera feeds, but Malcolm had vanished. Either he'd found the blind spots in their coverage, or he was waiting, letting the tension build. "Grace, listen to me." Roy kept his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "We stay in the house, doors and windows locked. He can't get in without making noise, and the second he tries, we'll know. The sheriff will be here soon. You don't know Malcolm like I do. He's planned this. Whatever he's going to do, he's thought it through." She was right. This wasn't a heat of the moment confrontation. Malcolm had been watching, waiting, studying their patterns and defenses. He wouldn't act unless he believed he had the advantage. A sound from the back of the house made them both freeze. Footsteps on the back porch, slow and deliberate. Then Malcolm's voice, loud enough to carry through the door. "Grace, I know you can hear me. I know you're scared. But this has gone on long enough. You belong with me. We took vows, for better or worse, remember? In sickness and health." Grace's hands tightened on the rifle. Roy moved closer to her, protective. "I've been patient," Malcolm continued, "more patient than you deserved. But my patience has limits. Come out now, and this ends peacefully. Make me come in there, and things get complicated. People could get hurt. Roy's a good man, Grace. Do you really want his blood on your hands?" "Don't listen to him," Roy said quietly. "He's trying to manipulate you." "I know," but Grace's voice was shaking. "But he's also right that he won't stop. And if you get hurt because of me, I won't. They heard him testing the back door, rattling the handle. Then silence again. He's circling, Grace said. Testing for weaknesses. It's what he does. He's patient when he's hunting. Roy checked his watch. The sheriff had been notified 12 minutes ago, 28 minutes minimum until help arrived. It felt like an eternity. Another sound, this time from the front of the house. Glass breaking. Roy and Grace ran to the living room and found a brick lying on the floor, surrounded by shattered window glass. Cold air poured through the broken window, but it was what they saw outside that made Roy's blood run cold. Mercy's stall door was open, and the donkey was gone. No, Roy breathed. That son of a bray echoed from somewhere past the barn. Mercy, distressed and calling for help. Grace grabbed Roy's arm. Don't! It's a trap. He's trying to draw you out. I know, but I can't leave her out there with him. Roy, please. It's what he wants. The second you step outside. She was cut off by another sound, this time from the side of the house. Something being dragged. Then the unmistakable smell of gasoline began to seep through the walls. Roy's mind raced. Malcolm was eliminating their options, backing them into an impossible choice. Stay inside and risk fire, or go outside and face him directly. The rifle, Roy said quickly. Give it to me. But Grace was already moving toward the back door, her face set, with terrible determination. No, this ends with me. I'm what he wants. I'm what he's always wanted. And I'm done running. Grace, don't! She pulled open the back door before Roy could stop her, stepping out onto the porch with the rifle raised. Roy followed immediately, refusing to let her face Malcolm alone. Malcolm stood 20 feet away, a gas can in one hand, matches in the other. Behind him, Mercy was tied to the fence, struggling against the rope. There she is, Malcolm said with satisfaction. My brave wife, finally ready to come home. Grace's voice was steady, stronger than Roy had ever heard it. I am not your wife. I am not your property. And I am not afraid of you anymore. Malcolm smiled, but his eyes were dead and cold. Oh, Grace, you should be. The standoff held for 3 heartbeats. Malcolm with his matches and gasoline, Grace with the rifle, Roy standing beside her, every muscle tensed for action. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of sirens beginning to wail. Malcolm heard them too. His expression shifted, calculation replacing confidence. Time's running out, Grace. Make your choice. Come with me now, or I burn this place to the ground with your protector inside. You won't. Grace's voice was rock steady now, and Roy realized something had fundamentally changed in her. The fear that had defined her for so long had transformed into something else, rage, perhaps, or simply the decision that enough was enough, because you need me to choose you. Dragging me away at gunpoint or from a burning building doesn't prove you won. It proves you lost. Malcolm's jaw tightened. You think you understand me? You think you know how this ends? I know exactly how this ends. You go to jail for arson, for assault, for stalking, for violating a restraining order across state lines. All the things you've done that you thought you were too smart to get caught for. Grace gestured with the rifle. And I know you're standing in clear view of 3 separate cameras, holding gasoline and matches, with a retired detective's knowledge of how this looks. So go ahead, Malcolm, light that match. Give them the evidence they need to lock you up for years. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Malcolm's face. He glanced toward the house, finally noticing the cameras Roy had installed. His professional training warred with his obsession, and Roy could see the moment the former started to win. Grace, put down the gas can, Malcolm. Put down the matches. Step away from the donkey. The sheriff is 2 minutes out now, maybe less. You can walk away from this with a trespassing charge, maybe stalking if they push it. Or you can commit arson in front of multiple cameras and spend the rest of your life in prison. Your choice. The sirens were close now, very close. Malcolm looked from Grace to Roy to the approaching sound of help, his face working through emotions too complex to name. The control he'd spent years maintaining was slipping away, and they all knew it. He set down the gas can slowly, the matches followed. But as he straightened, his hand went to his waistband, and Roy saw what Grace had already anticipated, the gun Malcolm had kept hidden until now. No! Roy lunged forward, putting himself between Malcolm and Grace. The shot rang out in the cold morning air, sharp and final. But it wasn't Malcolm's gun that had fired. Grace stood with the rifle still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. Malcolm was on the ground, clutching his shoulder, his own weapon fallen in the dirt beside him. She'd aimed to wound, not kill, a show of both mercy and control that Malcolm had never shown her. Roy kicked Malcolm's gun away, then checked the wound. Shoulder, bleeding but not life-threatening. Malcolm stared up at Grace with something like disbelief. "You shot me," he said, as if the very concept was impossible to process. "I defended myself and someone I care about from an armed threat," Grace replied. "Which is legal. Which you taught me, actually. Remember all those lectures about Montana's stand-your-ground laws?" Two sheriff's vehicles skidded to a halt in front of the house. Sheriff Patterson and his deputies emerged with weapons drawn, taking in the scene with trained efficiency. "Roy? Grace? You all right?" Bill called. "We're fine," Roy answered. "Malcolm Stewart, on the ground with a shoulder wound. He threatened us with arson and pulled a weapon. Grace defended us." The deputies moved in quickly, securing Malcolm and calling for an ambulance. Bill approached Roy and Grace, his expression a mixture of relief and concern. "I need statements from both of you, and we'll need to collect the cameras and any other evidence. It's all documented," Roy said. "Every threat, every appearance on the property, all of it." As the paramedics worked on Malcolm's shoulder, the deputies began gathering evidence. The gas can, the matches, Malcolm's gun, and most importantly, the rope. He'd used to tie up Mercy, which bore clear signs of the donkey's struggle and would show intent to harm or use animals as leverage. Malcolm was placed in handcuffs as soon as the paramedics had stabilized him. As the deputies led him toward the ambulance, he looked back at Grace one final time. But the power he'd held over her was gone. She met his gaze calmly, without fear, without doubt. "Goodbye, Malcolm," she said quietly. He didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. After the ambulance and one of the patrol cars had pulled away, Bill sat with Roy and Grace at the kitchen table, taking their statements. The adrenaline was wearing off now, leaving them both shaky and exhausted. "He'll be charged with multiple counts," Bill explained. "Trespassing, stalking across state lines, violation of a restraining order, assault with a deadly weapon, attempted arson, illegal use of firearms, and probably a few more, once the prosecutor reviews everything. With the video evidence and his own weapon in hand, there's no way he talks his way out of this." "How long?" Grace asked. "In prison, with his record and the premeditation involved? Could be looking at 10 to 15 years minimum, maybe more." Bill looked at her with something like admiration. "You did good, Grace. Kept your head, followed the law, protected yourself and Roy. That took real courage." After Bill left, promising to send deputies to patrol regularly until the case was settled, Roy and Grace sat in silence. The morning sun was finally breaking through the clouds, casting long shadows across the ranch. "I shot him," Grace said finally, her voice small. "You saved our lives." "I know, but still. I shot another human being." Roy reached across the table and took her hand. "You did what you had to do, and you did it with more restraint and mercy than he deserved. That says everything about who you are." Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Is it really over? Can it really be over? The legal system will do its job now. Malcolm's going to prison for a long time. And when he gets out, you'll have moved on with your life so completely that he won't even know where to start looking." Roy squeezed her hand. "Yes, Grace. It's really over." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the ranch that had become her sanctuary. Mercy was back in her stall, apparently unconcerned about the morning's drama, munching hay contentedly. "That donkey saved my life," Grace said. "Twice now. First finding me at the gate, then giving us the evidence we needed today. Mercy has good instincts about people. Roy joined her at the window. Sarah always said so. They stood together, watching the morning sun transform the winter landscape into something beautiful and clean. The threat that had hung over them for weeks was gone. Malcolm was in custody. The ranch was safe. And two people who'd thought themselves beyond second chances had found exactly that. Spring came slowly to Montana, the way it always did. The snow retreated inch by stubborn inch, revealing the brown grass beneath and the first brave shoots of green. The creek began to flow again, its voice a constant murmur that Roy had missed during the frozen months. The cattle moved with more energy, and even Mercy seemed younger, prancing through the pasture like she'd shed a decade along with winter's grip. Roy stood on the porch in the early morning light, a mug of coffee warming his hands. The air still carried a chill, but it was the clean cold of possibility rather than the harsh bite of survival. Behind him, he heard the screen door open and close softly. Grace joined him, her own mug steaming in the dawn air. She'd filled out over the past months, her face no longer carrying that hollow, hunted look. Her hair had grown longer, and she'd taken to pulling it back in a simple braid. The bruises had faded completely, and though Roy knew some scars ran deeper than skin, she carried herself with a quiet strength that seemed to grow each day. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the eastern ridge in shades of gold and pink. This had become their morning ritual, coffee on the porch, greeting the day together without need for words. Sometimes the best conversations were the ones that didn't require speaking. "Jennifer called yesterday while you were in town," Grace said finally. "I told her you'd call her back." Roy smiled. His daughter had been surprised when he'd finally told her about Grace, though she'd hidden it well. The weekly phone calls had taken on a different quality after that, less worried, more curious. Jennifer had even suggested coming out for a visit in the summer, bringing her husband and the grandkids Roy rarely saw. "I will," he said. "She's persistent. She cares about you. That's not persistence, that's love." Grace had a way of cutting through to the heart of things. It was one of the qualities Roy had come to appreciate most about her. She didn't waste words or dance around difficult truths. Life had worn away her tolerance for pretense. "You hear from your sister?" Roy asked, though he already knew the answer. Grace had started writing letters, actual handwritten letters on paper, and mailing them to an address in Oregon. She hadn't received any responses yet, but she kept writing anyway. "Not yet, but I will. She needs time to trust that I'm really okay." Grace took a sip of her coffee. 20 years is a long time to be lost. Can't expect people to just welcome you back overnight. Roy understood that better than most. Grace had told him her full story over the winter months, piece by piece like a puzzle being assembled in the firelight. The abusive marriage she'd finally fled, the years of hiding and fear, the shame that had kept her from reaching out to family. The night she'd ended up at his gate had been rock bottom, nowhere left to run, no strength left to keep going, just a desperate hope that maybe freezing to death would be easier than another day of being afraid. Instead, she'd found Mercy, and through Mercy, she'd found Roy. And somehow, improbably, they'd found a way forward together. "I was thinking," Grace said, her tone carefully casual, "that garden plot behind the barn might be good for vegetables. If you're willing to let me tear up some ground." Roy glanced at her, saw the hesitation in her eyes beneath the casual suggestion. She was asking for permanence, for a stake in the future, for permission to plan beyond the next week or month. "Been meaning to do something with that space for years," he said. "Sarah always wanted a proper garden there. Said the light was perfect." Grace's shoulders relaxed slightly. "I'll need to order seeds soon if we want anything by summer. We'll go into town next week. You can pick out whatever you want." The "we" hung in the air between them, comfortable and right. They'd become a "we" so gradually that Roy couldn't pinpoint exactly when it had happened. Somewhere between teaching Grace to bottle feed the orphaned calf and her teaching him to make bread from scratch. Somewhere between the long evenings working on the quilt together and the quiet mornings like this one. somewhere between two broken people and two healing souls who'd found unexpected grace in each other's company. Mercy wandered up from the barn, her bridle jingling softly. She'd taken to checking on them each morning, as if to make sure they were both still there. Grace reached down to scratch behind the donkey's ears, and Mercy leaned into the touch with obvious contentment. "Thank you, girl," Grace said softly, "for finding me, for not giving up." Roy watched them together, the woman and the donkey who'd saved each other on a frozen night. Sarah had been right about Mercy all those years ago. She was good company, and she'd had one more act of mercy left in her old bones. The wedding ring on Roy's finger caught the morning light. He'd stopped, twisting it absently sometime over the winter. It was still there, still part of him, but it no longer felt like a chain holding him to the past. Sarah would have liked Grace, he thought. She would have appreciated her quiet strength, her willingness to work hard, her gentle way with wounded things. And Sarah would have been glad he wasn't alone anymore. "Should probably check on that calf," Roy said, finishing his coffee. "Make sure she took her bottle this morning." "I'll come with you," Grace said. "Then we can start planning that garden." They walked together toward the barn, Mercy trailing behind them like a guardian spirit. The Montana prairie stretched out in all directions, vast and indifferent and beautiful in its harsh way. This land had witnessed 3 generations of Callahans, had seen love and loss, birth and death, the endless cycle of seasons that cared nothing for human concerns. But it had also seen 2 broken people find each other when they'd both given up on being found. It had seen loneliness transform into companionship, silence into conversation, separate griefs into shared hope. Roy looked at Grace as she opened the barn door, saw the small smile on her face as she greeted the cattle, and felt something he hadn't felt in 5 long years. Peace. Not the peace of forgetting or the peace of ending, but the peace of continuing. The peace of morning coffee and garden plans, and another day of living instead of just surviving. The quilt they'd made together hung over the back of the living room couch, visible through the window, a patchwork of old and new, past and present, sewn together with careful hands into something beautiful and warm. It would never replace Sarah's memory, and Grace would never erase the years she'd lost. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe the point was that even after everything, after loss and grief and mistakes and running and freezing and breaking, there could still be morning light on the porch. There could still be a garden planted in hope. There could still be 2 people who understood each other's silences and chose to stay anyway. Roy had lived alone for years, convinced his story had ended with Sarah. He'd been wrong. The story had simply been waiting for the next chapter, for a frozen night and a faithful donkey and a woman who needed finding just as much as he'd needed to be found. Spring had come slowly to Montana, but it had come, and with it, the promise that some things could grow again, even in the hardest soil. Inside the barn, Grace's laughter rang out as the calf butted her hand, demanding attention. Roy smiled and went to help her, Mercy trotting alongside, and the morning light followed them in through the open door. Some stories don't end, they just learn to begin again.